This video is the fourth video in a series on authentication built with Angular and MongoDB. Our application currently supports users to log in and also to sign up to our application, and we also have web tokens built in to also guard the routes in the middleware. If you haven't seen those videos, I'm going to leave the card to that in the top right, so do check it out before this one. This video is going to make authentication UI enhancements. So this means showing only the available actions for users after they have authenticated. We're also going to provide some redirection after they do log in, and we're going to finish it off by providing route guarding for all of our routes where we only want authenticated users to have access. I've left a link to the source code in the description down below. There you'll find the before and after folders. Before will contain the code at the start of the video, and after will contain the code at the end of the video, so do join along if you want to. Please give this video a thumbs up if you find it useful, and also consider subscribing to the channel for more videos on full stack web development. So if we take a look at our application, we currently have a few issues. So for example, the login and sign up buttons remain in the view even though a user might be logged in. There also isn't a logout button, and also the actions to add a new entry appear available even when a user isn't logged in, and this is something that they actually wouldn't be able to do. So the first update we make will be in the header, where we only want to show the login and sign up button if a user is not logged in, and we will want to see the logout button if they are logged in. I'll begin by adding a new list item in the angled brackets of li to our unordered list in the header component, and we'll add the text of logout within it. We'll want to show these list items depending on if the user is logged in or not. And the status of a user being logged in will be a subscription, so we will need to create a subject that emits this data from the auth service. So if I head to the auth service, I'm going to create a new subject, and then within angled brackets I'm going to put boolean, and this listener will be updated to true when the user logs in. I'll add a getter for this listener for the other components to subscribe to as get authenticated listener, and this is then going to return as observable. So now we can subscribe to this subject from other components to understand if a user is logged in or not. Then in the login function within the auth service, I will open a new if block to check that the token exists, and I'm going to call this .authenticated sub.next, and I'm going to pass in the value of true, and this is going to emit the value for the subject. If you like further details on subjects, I'll add the card to my video where we cover subjects a little bit more in the top right. We now want the header component to receive that subscription, so I will first inject the auth service through the constructor. I'll create the subscription and call it authentication sub and initialize it within the ng-on-init function. And I'll be doing this by obtaining the auth service and subscribing to it. I'll also create a boolean in the component as user authenticated, and this is going to be equal to false. Then we can take the value emitted from the listener and assign it to the boolean within the subscribe function. I'll also implement the onDestroy lifecycle hook within the component, and then within onDestroy I'm going to use it to unsubscribe from the subscription. So now that we have access to the status of a user being authenticated or not, I can update each of the list items in our header to be shown with the structural directive of ngIf. So for a new entry and the logout buttons, I'll want to show only if the user is authenticated. So if they're logged in, then they can see the new entry and they can log out. And the sign up and login buttons only if the user is not authenticated. So let's take a look at what this looks like in our application, and we can see that the data entry button is not visible and that we can only see login or sign up. And then if we log in, we can now see the data entry button is appearing and the logout button is also appearing. So we've made some really good progress so far for ensuring the header correctly shows for authenticated users only. Let's quickly make an update to the actions on the diary entries so only authenticated users can update or delete these entries. So in a similar way that I've done before for the header component, I'll create a new subscription and a boolean within the diary component. Here I'm going to subscribe to the auth service authentication subscription within the ng on init function. So I'm going to have to inject that auth service into the component. And then within the subscription, I'm going to update the isAuthenticated boolean. And then I'm also going to unsubscribe from that subscription when the component is destroyed. So in the diary component HTML, I'll then update the table header for actions to only show if the user is authenticated. And I'm going to do the exact same for the table data entry for those actions. Now if I reload our application, we can see the actions are not available if the user is not logged in. And now I'm just going to quickly log in and head back to the diary entries. And actually we can still see the actions are still not available. Okay, so the reason for this is that the subscription for the diary entries is created when we load the component, so when we select diary entries, when we select the home button. And the flow of actions we make are to authenticate, so that will emit the new isAuthenticated data to be true to all the components. However, when we then select home, we're reloading this diary component. So the subscription is then created and the true value that has been emitted from our auth service is not going to be received. So it's still going to be received as false. A simple solution here is to add a new boolean to the auth service, and I can just call this isAuthenticated. And I'll also add the getter for this. And then I will set this to true when the user logs in and the token is present. And lastly, within the diary component, I will also set the isAuthenticated boolean as equal to the isAuthenticated value from the auth service. I'll leave our subscription in place as we will later need it to reflect the login component when we log out. And I'm just going to quickly test this in the application. So if I just log in one more time and head back to the home, we can now see it working as expected. And that's because when we load this diary component, it's now going to be checking the isAuthenticated boolean within the auth service, which is now set as true. I'm going to quickly add some further cleaning up to the user experience to redirect users after they log into the home page. So I'll need access to the HTTP router in the auth service, and I'm just going to inject this within the constructor. And then within the login function, after a valid token has been received, I will navigate to the home page with this.router.navigate, and then within squared brackets, I will put / within quotes. So now we can quickly test this is working. So I'm just going to quickly log in. And when I select login, we're taken back to the home page. So far we've been able to prevent the visible components of diary entry and editing entries when a user is not authenticated. However, we are still able to manually enter that URL and access the pages even if we're not authenticated. So if I head into the application and enter / data-entry, we can still see the entry form even though we're not authenticated. And it's true, we won't be able to actually submit this because the token will be validated upon submission, but still we don't want the user to be able to access this page. So we're going to add some route redirection for if this were to happen back to, say, the login page, and we're going to do this through route guarding. So route guards are used to ensure only traffic we permit is enabled for specific routes. So for this, I will create a new file within the shared folder and going to call this route-guards.ts. And in a similar style to adding the interceptor in my previous video, Angular provides us with an interface to implement and a method to override that we can then inject into our application to perform every time a user attempts to access a route. So we're going to implement the canActivate interface, and this interface will require us to implement the canActivate method that accepts two arguments. So first we're going to have the activated route snapshot of where we're trying to access, and the router state snapshot of all available routes in the application. And this method will return a boolean or an observable or promise that contains a boolean, and this essentially will determine whether that route can be accessed or not. So within this method we want to check if the user is authenticated, and if they are, then we can return true. However, if we're not, we're simply just going to redirect them back to that login page. What I'll then do is provide this route guard to the specific routes in our app routing module for the authentication check to take place. So first let's inject the auth service into our route guard class. I'll mark the class with the @injectable annotation to ensure it can inject other services into it. And then within our canActivate method, I will obtain the boolean if the user is authenticated with the getAuthenticated method. Next, I'll check if the user is not authenticated with an if block. I'll navigate them back to the login page with the router. So again, I'm just going to inject that router through the constructor, and then I will call this.router.navigate, passing in the login page. Lastly, I'll return the isAuth boolean, which will be true in this case, to enable the user to access the page. The final step in applying the route guard is to specify which routes will use it. So if I head into the app routing module, I can inject the route guard within the decorator. So just under exports, I'll add a new key of providers, and then within squared brackets, I'll pass in the route guard. Each route that we specify within our routing module can accept an array of guards after the property of canActivate. So for the data-entry and the edit routes, I'll add a new argument after the component called canActivate, and I'll pass in an array with just the route guard specified within it. Now if I reload the app and try to manually navigate to /data-entry, we can see that we're automatically taken to the login page. This is great. So that concludes this video on how we can improve the user interface to guide the user into which actions are possible, how we can redirect the user once they are authenticated, and also to protect routes from being accessed by users who are not authenticated. If you haven't already, check out my playlist on MongoDB and authentication, and then in the next video we will hook in the ability to log out for the user, and we'll look at how we can store the token within the browser as opposed within the application. And that will complete this series on MongoDB with authentication. So I'll see you in the next video.